Hello everyone. Today I'll be covering the action potential, how neurons fire, the action potentials, neurons, nervous system, what does it all mean? Let's get into our key idea. We want to go over action potentials. Action potentials are the rapid temporary change in a membrane potential that travels down the axon. Now, this may seem a little bit confusing by now, but by now we should have covered nervous system, neurons, anatomical features of a neuron, and you can kind of see by this collage below of some things that I'll be getting into. With that being said, we're going to be focusing on our graphs here. This is the meat and potatoes of our action potential. With that being said, let's get into it. The action potential begins at our resting membrane potential. Now, there must be a resting state that the body exists in. We know that homeostasis is always trying to get us into this position, and that this is done through negative feedback loops. So you'll kind of see the action potential as kind of being this big feedback loop. And how does it do this? Well, let's find out. The resting membrane potential sits at around negative 70 millivolts. You'll see this kind of charged electricity. Like, what does it all mean? Well, our body actually has charged ions, and believe it or not, actually does work with this kind of electrical, gradient. And this is done by gradients. So the inside of our cell is going to be more negative than our outside of the cell here in our cytoplasm. Sodium is high on the outside of our cell and potassium is high on the inside. This is maintained through our sodium-potassium pump, which we'll get into more later. So let's start with depolarization. Depolarization is our first step. We have our negative 70 resting potential, and when we reach this threshold of negative 55 millivolts, we will start our action potential. Now, it starts with depolarization, and what does depolarization mean? It just means that we're getting excited. We have our stimulus that starts after this threshold, and then it opens up voltage-gated sodium channels. The sodium then rushes in, and our membrane becomes positive, and you see it reaches this plus 30 millivolts. This is our maximum. Once we've reached this maximum, we can start our repolarization. Our sodium channels deactivate. Now, what does this mean, deactivate? So we have our resting that is closed with our activation gate, our open, the activation gate opens, and then our inactive gate. You can see it's still closed, but it's through a different gate. And notice how this is a slow kind of closing. This is a good way for our body to reach the exact points that we want without abruptly stopping or, interrupting any processes still completing. So these channels are deactivated, and now our voltage-gated potassium channels can open. Once they're opened, the potassium then leaves the cell and becomes negative again. This can make sense because we have our sodium and potassium as both positively charged ions, and if they are moving past each other and kind of equaling each other out, we can see why our depolarization of excitability goes up and our repolarization repolarizes the cell membrane and comes back down. Now, it comes back down below our threshold. So this is called hyperpolarization. The reason why this happens is because our potassium channels are slowly closing instead of abruptly closing. The membrane dips below our resting potential, and then pumps then restore our resting potential. We said that channels open for both sides, but our pump is what does our hyperrepolarization. Now, you can kind of see here in this picture of what exactly does it look like when I'm going through each step. Our resting is going to be no movement, but in reality, we have these free channels where sodium and potassium and other charged ions can freely move in and out of the cell, but these are going to be for smaller regulation. For the purposes of what we're learning, we're going to say no movement during resting potential. And in depolarization, our sodium comes into the cell. Repolarization, our potassium then leaves the cell. And for our resting potential, we're going to see the sodium-potassium pump, where 3 sodium ions are going to come into the pump, leave the cell, and then 2 potassium are going to come in and enter the cell. Now, this is done through like a primary active transport because there is ATP involved and kind of a anti-Porter system where the ions are moving past each other. Let's go into refractory periods. Now that we've gone over the steps of an action potential, let's go through the specifics of a action potential. Action potential is experienced in all or nothing. And all or nothing basically means that once our action potential starts, there is no stopping it. So our action potential experiences in all or nothing. Now, an absolute refractory period means that once we've began this process, no new action potential can start. But this is for our absolute refractory period. If we are in a relative refractory period, we can start a new action potential, but only when we have a stronger stimulus and when our membrane is in a hyperpolarized state, meaning it's in hyperpolarization. Okay, let's check your understanding. How much do you remember so far? Let's erase these answers here. Let's go step by step. What ion rushes in during depolarization? Well, we remember depolarization is our starting, and we know that our starting is going to involve sodium ion, sodium ions through our sodium channels. What causes repolarization? Well, if sodium causes our depolarization, what causes our repolarization? Well, potassium. Potassium must be the other one because those are the two ions that we focused on. Why can't an action potential go backwards? Well, we know that action potential is experienced an all or none mechanism, where an action potential goes through a threshold and can no longer stop or go backwards. It only goes forwards. Let's get into some more specific questions, specifically in anatomy and in a medical sense. So we know lidocaine is a localized numbing agent used in medicine. So lidocaine blocks the voltage-gated sodium channels. What phase of the action potential does this prevent? So we said that our depolarization is involved with our sodium ions. So if this blocks sodium channels, we are likely blocking or preventing depolarization. Next, we have a patient has dangerously high extracellular potassium. How would this shift resting membrane potential and why could this lead to cardiac arrhythmias? Well, we know that the inside of the cell is going to have more potassium in general. But if we have a high extracellular potassium, we know that potassium and sodium are now on the outside of the cell and there's a lot more of it. Now, this is going to change our resting membrane potential and actually increase our membrane potential because we have more leaving the cell. Why could this lead to cardiac arrhythmias? Well, if we have a higher resting membrane potential, we're going to have our normal resting membrane potential, and now we're going to have an increased resting membrane potential. Notice how everything else stays the same, including our threshold. Now, if we're really close to our threshold, it doesn't take much to start it, and we can have more accidental starts. And once we start an action potential, there is no going back, so we can trigger an arrhythmia, meaning we can trigger our heart to beat out of order. This is not good, so it's very important that we maintain a resting membrane potential that is stable. Well, that's all, guys. I hope you were able to understand action potentials. Thanks. I'd say more, but I'm in my refractory period for now. Thank you.